Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Spoiler Warning Podcast. This is part 2 of our coverage of all the films that we saw at TIFF. I'm Christopher Schnese.
And I'm Stephen Miller.
And if you're joining us for the first time, the Spoiler Warning Podcast is a weekly film review program. Each week on the show, we're going to dive in, debate, discuss, and argue over the latest films coming to a theater near you. Of course, we're usually talking about things coming to a theater near you. Now we're going to be talking about things that will eventually come to a theater near you, at least in most cases, I assume. But yeah, as we said, this is part 2 of our coverage of TIFF. In part 1, we covered 8 films. This episode, we're going to cover 9 films, and then eventually we'll have a part 3, pulling back the curtain. We leave tomorrow, so this is the first window we had to sort of record the part 2. Sometime after we return home, we will record the part 3, and then you'll have everything that we saw here at TIFF. Steven, how you holding up?
I'm holding up pretty well. This is always about when in the festival I start to feel tired, you know? That has definitely been hitting me a bit more, where I'm just catching myself not struggling to pay attention during movies. Like, when a movie clicks, it always clicks for me. Like, I'm never afraid that I would have loved a movie, but because of tiredness, I didn't. You know, I think I can usually tell how I feel still. But I'm definitely feeling myself more, especially when a movie is trying my patience. Fighting to keep caring and appreciating the things that might round it up from like a C to a B, you know?
Yeah.
So I think this is the right duration for a festival. And even with us being a little bit more gentle on our schedule this year, I still am feeling the toll of 3 to 4 movies a day. You know, there's only so many days you can do that before your brain can stop processing narratives, I think.
Yeah, and I think doctors say it's 11, which is how long the festival goes for. So I guess that's why they cut it off there.
Right.
But yeah, you ready to dive into them, Stephen?
I'm ready.
All right. Why don't you start us off?
All right. So the first movie, if I'm counting right, that we are going to talk about today is a film called Conclave by director Edward Berger. He's most well known for directing All Quiet on the Western Front, which I actually never caught up with, but I know people really loved it for the tension and the direction in particular. Like, people felt like it was a really intense movie. You're nodding like maybe you saw it.
I did not see it, but I remember all the conversation around it. Apparently it's a pretty brutal war film. So might be curious to go check it out now. I guess we'll find out in just a moment.
Definitely, because this movie sees him very much changing gears from that, telling a story about the election is the wrong word, the selection of a new pope. It basically takes you inside the conclave in the Vatican, where the dean, I believe is his official title, played by Ralph Fiennes, basically has to organize the assembly of all of the bishops and dioceses and things that I don't know the name of, you know, in the papal system. Yes, the cardinals, as they all basically get one person, one vote, and have. Technically, they are not having debates or discussions about this, but there's a lot of wheeling and dealing behind the scenes that this movie gets into, and it's all kind of about the crisis of confidence of what does it mean to pick a new pope. I liked this one quite a bit. I didn't love it, but I liked it. I mean, I think it's been well established already that you and I like movies about popes. We enjoyed the 2 popes here quite a bit.
Yeah.
And so I was really excited for this one. And I think like the visual style is arresting. Like, I think the look and feel was totally solid here. I think it does build tension out of a not necessarily that tense seeming premise of a bunch of people sitting in a room and thinking about who ought to be the pope. And it trusts the audience, which is something I always like. Like, this movie doesn't take care to over-explain everything in the first like 15 minutes. Like, it's happy to unfold over time and trust that like you're going to pick up the little pieces along the way.
It's not cutting to like a news reporter outside
Definitely.
Conclave going, and here we're waiting for them to select in just a moment. They're going. It just lets you see the proceedings.
Yes, definitely. But I did feel like it lacked a little bit of narrative momentum. Like, it never totally kicked into gear the way that I would have wanted to. And it could have done it in 2 different ways. It could have launched into broad philosophic discussions, right? This could have been like 12 Angry Men, but for the Pope, you know? Or it could have put me in the head of Ralph Fiennes' like tortured decision-making process and all the steps that he's doing to try to figure out the right move. You know, it could have been the teacher's lounge, basically, of like tracing what does it mean when a person keeps digging and digging for the truth, and at what point is that going to hurt rather than help? And instead it kind of, it kept it a little bit more like solemn and austere almost, where it was like, it feels much more like a movie that is quietly about faith and process without really trying to dig too deeply into the why behind it. And I don't know, I thought it was like well acted. It was an enjoyable experience. It just like, it was missing an oomph that would have made me really, really love it. How about you?
Yeah, I think I'm kind of in the same boat as you. Like, I did very much enjoy this film, and I liked the sort of nature of us just getting to see behind the curtain in the conclave and figure out how this process works. And it's, you know, when you think of something like a role like the Pope, where they're sort of like the head of the church, and you assume that like it should be the best person for the job should have it. And then this film sort of portrays it as there's a lot more things involved in like, well, we can't have that guy. So
Right.
Who else could we have that might not be the best Pope, but would be better than the alternative? You know, like it turns it into like a real political thing that is happening. You know, and I enjoyed that aspect of it. You know, I did enjoy just the seeing and the not telling. I was a little bit confused at whether, because, you know, they're all sequestered, but they're sequestered in groups. Mm-hmm. So it's like, they're all voting and they're not allowed to have open debate except for when they go to that one dark room.
Right.
So I didn't really understand the context of, you know, because you know, the first time you see the vote happen, right? The vote happens, the numbers are rolled out, and they're like, well, since nobody got it, we'll vote again. And they immediately revote.
Right.
It presents it as though they literally start the second that they finish counting the votes, and then the numbers change. But there wasn't discussion, right? Like somebody wasn't like, "Ooh, that guy's winning. Oh, I'm going to throw my votes behind it." Like there's some aspect that you're not getting from there. But in all, this is like a low stakes version of like Succession or like Game of Thrones, right? Where it's a bunch of people not conspiring, but like kind of having these conversations behind closed doors about like, hey, what is better for who? We know we want this sort of ideals to be presented, but then somebody's like, hey, you're the guy who it has to be. And it's like, well, hope you guys know I'm for this. So if you want to make it me, then that's fine. But other people are not going to be able to get behind it. Like there's a lot of willing and dealing, which you wouldn't think there would be in this sort of situation, right? Like this isn't a divine choice. This is a bunch of people with one rank choosing a rank higher than them and kind of all collaborating together. So all in all, I really enjoyed this and seeing the moment to moment play out. But yeah, it didn't quite have the oomph. You know, there is some conversation around doubt in faith, but it's not like in the two popes. It's specifically two people having a conversation about like, hey, you and I disagree about this position, but I still think you are the person who should be able to take over this mantle. And this is like the opposite conversation where it's like, we gotta make sure it's not Donald Trump, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Which is like a weird context to put the who's going to be the next pope debate. You know, everybody in the world is like watching those little chimneys, trying to see what color smoke's going to come out so they know whether or not they're chosen, but they have no context for why somebody was chosen. They don't know whether it's a bunch of stuff was unearthed about different people and people had to bow out or whatever, but I don't know, there's a lot happening in it, and I enjoyed the ride. But yeah, it probably won't stick with me too much, but I definitely enjoyed what I saw.
Yeah. And I do just want to say, too, that I think Stanley Tucci is really good in this movie. It's been a while since I've seen him get to give like a heartfelt role like that, and I think he really nails it as the kind of a Pope Francis-esque type, but if he were American instead, you know, he's like the more progressive Pope, and I think he gets like a few good scenes of kind of the quiet reflection.
Cool. All right. So moving on, you know, in the last episode, I talked about The Heretic being a film that is coming out semi-soon, but still being one I was really anticipated to see. This next one is probably the thing that was the most anticipated for me, and that is The Wild Robot. So this is coming out in like a few weeks, but I really, really wanted to see it because I'm a sucker for these type of films. So The Wild Robot is directed by Chris Sanders, who you might know from little things like How to Train Your Dragon, The Croods, writing on Mulan, Lion King, Aladdin, like a bunch of these things that, you know, we grew up watching and stuff. And, you know, this is the story of a robot that is meant to be like a helper around the house, do chores, do things you don't want to do, like your own little like robotic TaskRabbit, right, to help you do all your things. One of these robots gets like dropped out of a plane into the wilderness. It boots itself up, or it gets booted up, and tries to go about helping animals in the wilderness do tasks that it interprets as them needing to be completed. And you know, it's kind of a fun premise. You expect a lot of cute stuff, but it actually turns into like a kind of deep dissection on parenthood, found family, what it's like to grow up and look up towards parents and stuff like that. So I think that this film for me turned out to be everything I had hoped it would be. I love this film. I thought it was amazing. If you're a longtime listener to the podcast, you know I'm a sucker for films about robots learning to love. So you know, it's everything that I wanted it to be. And yeah, Stephen, what did you think of it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm doing a couple write-ups for David Chen's newsletter, Decoding Everything, and in each one I'm trying to make some recommendations. And this one I purposely held back from my first write-up because I wanted to be sure I would have at least one thing I could glowingly recommend the second time around. Yeah, I totally fell for this movie. You know, I would say I love it too, even though I don't think it's like anywhere near a perfect movie. I just don't give a shit. Like a lot of kids' movies, this one really wins me over with its setup and maybe like the first half where it's just exploring what the setup means. In this case, the idea of a robot suddenly being in the wilderness, having to work with all these animals, and a robot learning how to be a parent, you know? Like you mentioned robots learning to love is something that, you know, you're a sucker for. And we've seen a lot of movies, some adult and some more childish, about the idea of someone like figuring out what life is. You know, Swiss Army Man is kind of like the canonical example that we both loved.
Yeah.
This is the first time I've seen that from the perspective of what does it mean to be a parent, right? What does it mean to care for someone else, to want them to survive, to be there for them? And I thought this was just a super moving depiction of like motherhood, frankly. The robot Roz, who's played by Lupita Nyong'o, I think she's really, really wonderful here. She's so eager to please, and she has all these tools in her arsenal, but the task of really loving another creature and caring for them takes all of her energy, and it becomes almost like the giving tree, you know? It's like the thing that like they will take and take and take and take and take. And this movie made me tear up multiple times. Like there's a scene of flying that kind of like How to Train Your Dragon, just like I didn't even know why I was feeling emotional. It isn't like it had built up the stakes in a way where I'd been spending 30 minutes hoping flying was going to happen. You know, It's just like it worked anyway. It's just like a montage set to music that it really stirred a lot in me. There are some moments here where characters like say goodbye to each other that got me real good too. And just in general, it's so heartfelt. It's also a lot darker in its comedy than I think I was expecting for a DreamWorks film. I mean, this is a movie, it is about the animal kingdom, which means death happens in this movie, like including jokes. There's a hilarious moment where a mama possum is talking about her kids and revises the number mid-sentence. And even the whole central premise here of a robot basically raising a little, is it a goose? I should know that already. Yeah. A little goose gosling. As her own. Yeah, the gosling. That happens because the parents are dead, right? And not in like a, oh, you lost your parents at a young age. Look, I'm going to swoop in and help you. Like, we basically see it. I mean, there's a darkness to this that I really, really liked. And I feel like a lot of the voice cast is just having a ton of fun, like delivering these surprisingly edgy for a kids movie lines in a straight way. Yeah, like
where the adults in the audience are laughing harder than the kids in the audience.
Exactly, yeah. I think this looks beautiful too. Like I saw that this is expected to be the final animated film by DreamWorks that is like fully made in-house. Like from now on, they're going to start using more like third parties to do that kind of thing. And I mean, if they have to go out on one, I think it's a lovely one to go out on. There's a mix of like kind of 2D pastel, like almost like watercolor painting, and then standard 3D stuff that we're used to. And I think it just blends it really, really well. The criticism that I don't even really care about as a criticism is that, like a lot of kids' movies, including Up, this feels the need to then like tell a story and have stakes and like a big third act and everything. And I didn't really give a shit about any of that, you know, like this movie kind of has to strain to make it be about more than what it wants to be about, which is just like sitting in this feeling of parenthood and the bonding of mother and child.
Yeah.
But that core idea alone was just, it's beautiful. Like I really love this movie.
And I've watched the trailer for this like 1,000 times, and the trailer is mostly no dialogue, right? It's just watching this robot in nature interact with animals. So like, you know, this film has a huge voice cast, right? Mm-hmm. And it's kind of like when it started, part of me was like, oh yeah, I forgot that there's actual voices in this movie, and I didn't know how it was going to sit with me. But I don't know why, but the fact that like Roz goes into learning mode and just machine learns all animal language, and that it's not just that they're not anthropomorphized animals. It's literally the robot learned what each animal communicates. I don't know how different types of animals use the same language. That's a little silly. I'll forgive that. But I just love that, like, it was just machine learned dialogue for all the animals.
Yeah.
That gave me a good chuckle.
Yeah, I thought that was a really clever way to get the kids movie talking animal thing while still keeping the world authentic. And I had a lot of fun just playing the who is this voice actor game, like throughout the movie. Like I mentioned to you already, there's a moment where we see an older goose, and just looking at the face of how the animators decided to make the goose, I was like, that's Bill Nighy. Bill Nighy's voice is about to come out of that goose. Mark Hamill, by the way, is just killing it this year as like an old grumpy dude. I feel like he's found his groove, and he's doing great work.
Yeah.
All right. Moving on to a very similar film in many respects. I'm kidding. Luca Guadagnino's Queer. This is a movie that stars Daniel Craig, and it is based on a William S. Burroughs novel, or kind of short novel, I think, about a guy who is living down in, I want to say Mexico City. I actually didn't look up where that's supposed to be.
Yeah, I don't remember.
He's living somewhere in like, in Mexico or else in Central America. And he basically just spends his days drinking and hanging out with people and kind of ruminating on what it means to be queer. And the film is kind of about him noticing a new person, Allerton, played by Drew Starsky, who's kind of this young, I guess either bisexual or questioning guy who he's got a girlfriend and he's kind of like floating through life, but he sees something in him and he like wants to have him in some way, like he wants to know him. And the movie's just, I'm struggling to describe this movie because it's really mostly just a vibe, right?
Yeah.
It's just about Daniel Craig in this time and place, like being a kind of self-destructive gay man and doing what he does. So I've read some William S. Burroughs, like Naked Lunch and Junkie, so I'm like kind of familiar with his style. And this feels like a movie that is meant to look and feel like what reading a book by him feels like, which means there's drug use, characters are self-destructive, they're kind of abrasive, they're not very gentle or kind to one another. It's very matter-of-fact in the way it tells things. Like, it just kind of shows Daniel Craig taking actions that I wouldn't take. and it doesn't usually bother to try to go into his head and be like, why did I do this? What is the emotional core behind it? It's really just like a portrait of being detached and aimless and kind of like roaming through life hunting for some kind of hedonistic pleasure.
Yeah.
Knowing that Luca was making a movie called Queer, I was really hoping for something that was a little bit more emotional, raw. Like I expected this to be about drug addicts. I expected this to be a kind of like rough depiction of life. But I thought there was going to be more of a beating heart or at least sadness to it, rather than the kind of almost like hip detachment, which is what the movie decides to be instead. Like it's all very, I don't know. It's very like cool, and I thought the look and feel was cool, and I actually vibed with the movie the whole way through. Like I wasn't really bored or unhappy with it, but I wanted to get some kind of like emotionally resonant thing rather than just like watching Lee from the outside fumble into different experiences and go on drug trips and things like that. I don't know. It was an odd movie. Like I liked it fine as like a literary thing. And we watched Gonzo Girl last year, which was the equivalent of this for Hunter S. Thompson. And like I like those kind of things. I'm fine with it. But I just wanted more, especially when Challengers was still my favorite movie of the year so far. I think. I just really was hoping that Luca was going to give me another thing that would really get my pulse quickening a bit.
Yeah, like with Gonzo Girl, I still didn't have any background to help me with that film, but the individual scene-to-scene conversations and the motivations of the characters were enough to sort of pull me into that story and like care about it, albeit temporarily, right? In Queer, I I found myself just lost and not understanding what was happening. Like, even from the moment, like, we're introduced to Daniel Craig, I guess he owns all the bars that he keeps going into, because he just walks in and gets a drink and then walks out and goes and stumbles around. And I'm like, I guess you're just running a tab in the city and you're just gonna, like, I just, literally every decision these characters make, I was kind of like, this feels like it's coming from somewhere, but I don't know. I'm just watching this film. So for me, it was really hard to attach myself to this story as it was happening, because, as you said, it's all about the vibes. And while the vibes were occasionally like fun and interesting, I didn't know what we were doing from any scene, or what characters' motivations were, or why they're going on this like adventure to find this drug, which apparently comes from the other book. But it just, for me, I felt really, really lost. So it was hard for me to like celebrate the film, just because I didn't understand it, like what we were watching or why we were watching it, like in the moment. All that being said, Jason Schwartzman is fucking amazing in this movie.
He's great. I don't know if this will mean much to you, but I'm convinced he's being coded as Allen Ginsberg, just like the main guy is being coded as being William S. Burroughs.
Okay.
People who are smarter than me or who read the book can tell me if I'm right or not.
Whatever he was doing, though, I was there for it. So every scene he was not in, I wanted him to be in it. It wasn't really like an audience surrogate type of thing, but it was like he was watching a film, the film he was in the way that I wish I was watching it, you know, and instead I was waiting for him to come back to sort of like rope me in to whatever the hell it was that he was doing, because it was amazing. But yeah, all in all, this film didn't work for me, but it felt like I was missing out on stuff because I hadn't consumed anything leading into it. So it kind of just, it felt like I was like not in on the, not joke, but like I was not in on whatever it was going for. So. All right. Next up, we have a little film called Riff Raff. Riff Raff is a little film directed by Dito Montiel, and it stars a bunch of people, including Ed Harris, Jennifer Coolidge, and Bill Murray. And it is basically a story of kind of like, you know, ex-retired criminals and how their world might get a little turned upside down as sort of their past lives sort of rush back into the current life as they sort of are focused on their sort of retired lives. This is a film that I think we kind of added to the docket just as a light thing that might be kind of fun. And you know what? I kind of like this film. I was surprised by how much I enjoyed it. Like it feels very small, but also feels like very confident in like kind of a really, it was just fun, like across the board. Like all the performances are great. And it's just this like silly film, but there are high stakes, but there are stakes that like nobody is telling you are there, but you know they're there. Like there's no way they're not there, but you're just kind of waiting for it all to be kind of revealed and let everything kind of collide together as this film goes on. But yeah, I found it like super funny. The performances were great. I love like Pete Davidson's character just like commenting on the fact that he's experiencing the film. It's like back to like the Jason Schwartzman thing from Queer, right? It's like his, like when he showed up, as soon as he showed up, there was like a chuckle from somebody seated kind of near us, like, oh, he's in this movie too. But then like the way his character is kind of just being shepherded along in his journey to meet all these people, and he's just commenting on it the whole time. I know something about it just totally worked for me, and I had a great time with it. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, we've had a kind of running joke that's not really a joke throughout the fest, that like there's one movie that I can never remember we watched, and Riff Raff is that movie, which makes it sound like a criticism. But actually, like you, I liked this movie. You know, I liked it quite a bit, at least while I was watching it. Like it's small and light and doesn't really linger in the mind, and I don't think that's a bad thing. Like you want to have these snacks that like make you chuckle and just give an actor, you know, a chance to do good work.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned the cast is great. Like Jennifer Coolidge does her Jennifer Coolidge thing really well in this movie. Ed Harris, I think, is really solid here. Bill Murray and Pete Davidson play a pair of mobsters that like really steal every scene they're in.
Yeah.
There are some really like deliciously dark comedic moments here, especially a whole sequence involving like neighbors helping some people out that I got so many laughs out of that part.
Yeah.
Yeah, like there's a lot of good stuff here, but it is kind of like if you took a history of violence and just decided like let's have nothing on its mind instead. Like it's very light, and there's nothing really new that the movie is doing, you know, in any direction. It's just kind of a cast playing dress up and having fun, you know, inhabiting these characters for a while. But yeah, you know, it's fun. It's fine, and like I already forgot it again.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean if this comes on like Netflix or something, I think you should totally watch it one afternoon and have a great time, and then you too can forget it right after.
And then rediscover it on Netflix later.
Exactly. You can watch it over and over and over again. All right. The next movie that we're talking about is a film called Under the Volcano. This was directed by Damian Kokur, who I believe was a Polish director, but it's really about Ukrainians. And I want to say he mentioned that it was co-written with a Ukrainian woman, I think. But yeah, this is following a Ukrainian family on Tenerife, which is part of the Canary Islands, who are on vacation, and then basically the day that they were planning on flying home, they learned that Ukraine had been invaded by Russia. And this becomes a movie about how this family who is stranded in this kind of beautiful paradise deals with their emotions. You know, I've definitely seen movies before that have to do with like the literal trouble in paradise, you know, where you're in a beautiful place, but you're having a terrible time. This movie I thought was really, really, really interesting in the way it tries to unpack like cognitive dissonance, right? This is a movie, when I read the description of this, I thought it was going to be an intensely like heavy, harrowing story about a family who is lost, who presumably are going to become, you know, like immigrants who are like undocumented or unwanted or who have to shuttle around. And I thought this was going to be like a really harrowing family story. And instead it's much more just about how people try to deal with something that is so big and terrifying that they can't actually process it.
Yeah.
So we really spend the whole runtime just watching this family channel their stress and fear into other things that they can control instead, right? Like arguments about a hike and who forgot to pack the phone charger, or a sudden protective instinct of, you know, the teenage daughter leaving without telling anyone where she was going, you know, like you have to tell me what if something happened to you, etc. Like everyone is kind of like processing things and they just bubble over in very tense, interesting ways. It is not the movie I was expecting at all, and the more I think about it, the more I like really, really, really actually like this. Like I just think it's a very, very interesting way to tell this story, kind of like obliquely without showing you too much of what is going on. And I don't know, it just felt very accurate and interesting to me, like the way that these people like struggle to process something that is like so big and intense that they really can't process it at all. There are a few times the characters do share their emotions, you know, they say it out loud directly. And I think those moments work really well and feel very earned because the movie isn't mashing that button too many times. So yeah, I thought like this just stuck to its guns from beginning to end. We compared it to After Sun when we were leaving the theater. And even though this doesn't have the same kind of incredible gut punch that After Sun has, I do think it's treading similar territory, and it's similarly just committed to following that the whole way through. And I really admired this movie. Like I've been thinking about it a lot in the days since we watched it. How about you?
Yeah, I do think it is an interesting film. Like kind of as you said, you know, when you read the premise for this film, you have an expectation of what you're going to get, and you expect it will be specifically about the family dealing with how do they get home or figure out what they're going to do, you know, with dealing with the Russian invasion. But it's really about that. That's all the backdrop. It's really a story about what if you're stuck on vacation, but you can't really complain about it because there's something way worse happening back home. And just like one of the interesting things it does is that there's parts where like one of the young girl is talking to friends back home, and they're asking her about like posting the vacation stuff to Instagram, and she won't post things because it's like it feels like it's inappropriate. So like you can't really look, I'm having fun over here on this island while like shit's happening back home. And there's an interesting way where it portrays like individual characters' observations about themselves and what they're going through in the context of the back home thing, but the back home thing is so far away and not actually technically present in what they're going through. And like to your point, you were saying that like it feels like, you know, are they going to become refugees? What's going to happen to them? But like everybody in the town is like, oh yeah, you can just stay in the hotel as long as you need to. We know what's happening. Just like go for it, you know? And it seems like there aren't any actual problems other than they can't currently fly home, right? And everything else about their day to day is kind of normal extended vacation time, but they're all dealing with what's happening back home in a different way. And I think it's super interesting. And like as you said, it's not quite to the level of what After Sun does, but it's definitely After Sun adjacent. Yeah. And like if you're watching the film framed through the young girl's eyes and you see how she is experiencing what her family's going through, like she kind of doesn't have a real bearing on what she's experiencing both on vacation and back home. So she's just kind of like observing the rest of the family and trying to just, you know, her main concern is like, is anybody going to talk to me? Yeah. Or what's going to happen? So it's definitely doing interesting stuff. So I enjoyed it for kind of what it presented. But it sounds like you have like a much fonder feeling towards this film.
Yeah, I mean, it just, even while it was going on, I just was catching things that it was doing. I complain a lot on this podcast when people don't trust the audience, like when they hold their hand too much or tell them too much about what things mean. And this movie goes in the opposite direction, right? Like we are using the word refugee, but the movie never has them openly worry about that. What it does instead is has a West African guy who is selling things on the beach side, who is kind of presumed, and we later learn a bit about his story. He becomes the stand-in for that, and we kind of know that characters are thinking about that, even though they never say it, right? Or there are noises that make characters suddenly shudder. There's a Russian family staying at the hotel, and for a lot of the runtime, no one addresses that in any way, but just like you can feel like the air kind of leave the room a little bit whenever it happens. And things like that, I really just respected a lot what it was going for. And I think, to me, this is the kind of movie I want to see about shattering events rather than trying to steer directly into it and then maybe be like emotionally manipulative or portray it wrong.
Yeah, and like this film allows it to not be locked in this moment in time, but it could be anything that was happening. It just happens to be that right now it's real world events. All right, so moving on, the next film on the list is just a little film, you know, both in scope and runtime. A little film called The Brutalist. Okay, so this film is directed by Brady Corbett, who made a little film that we've talked about on the podcast called Vox Lux, which I believe I didn't like.
I don't think you liked it at all.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so basically this film stars Adrian Brody as Laszlo Toth, who is an architect, and he basically is escaping after World War II. He's escaping Europe, comes to America, and meets a rich dude who wants to eventually commission him to build something for him. This is a sprawling epic that's kind of like a big chunk of the life of Laszlo, and it really focuses on an artist who, does something very, very specific with his art, and sort of his long time plan to build this like ridiculously huge building that is actually 4 buildings in one, and kind of him giving his life to this one project and sort of what it means to him and what it might mean to people who know of him or who are related to him. And I think it's, this film has an intermission. It is like 3.5 hours long or whatever it is. It has an intermission. I think the first half is just sails along and is really gripping and draws you in. You're like really, really on board. The second half, has to bring the story to an end. And I think that the second half maybe is not as strong in my book, at least not as propulsive as the first half is. But then I think it totally lands the plane, and it sort of, by the end of the film, you better understand what the true goal is of the character and what he was actually building and why it was so important to finish this thing on his own terms and everything like that. And I think that all in all, this is a beautiful film. Really, really liked it. Performances are great. Didn't feel like 3.5 hours, which is always a good thing. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. Stephen, what did you think of The Brutalist?
Yeah, I mean, we weren't originally going to see this movie, and then buzz out of Venice was like overwhelming. People were saying like this was the Godfather of our generation and like a new heralding in like a new era in American cinema, like the most ridiculously highfalutin praise you could give something. And I was like, fuck, okay, well, we have to watch this, right? Like, we can't not see this movie now.
And to be fair, it was originally on the list.
Yes.
We were going to see it, and then we removed it due to runtime,
Yes.
and then we added it back.
We both felt like a festival was not the right place to watch a 3.5-hour movie and give it a fair shot.
Yeah.
But yeah, I added it back in. We kind of reshuffled our schedule to make it work, and I'm so glad I did, because I think this movie is amazing. Like, it's incredible. It is, like you said, it's a sprawling epic. It covers a lot of ground. It's a period piece that feels to me like it was actually filmed in that period. Like, it blows my mind that they haven't announced what the budget was for this movie, but Brady Corbett's last movie has earned a combined total of $2 million. So like there's no way that this movie had that much funding behind it, right? Like, this is clearly a passion project that he made because he wanted to make it. And it looks like a massive big budget spectacle to me. Like, it is unreal how much this feels like authentic 40s and 50s America. And like, he's constructing a giant building, he's living in this time, and everything just feels so real, and it was just like incredible to me. I thought this movie just looked amazing. The cast, I think, is really phenomenal too. Like, Adrian Brody, he basically just seems like he is a Hungarian architect in the mid-century that like Brady Corbett like plucked out and was like, hey, play yourself, improvise.
Yeah,
like, he just is so good and raw, and plays this kind of really morally complicated character in a way that I thought was great. I agree with you that the first half is definitely stronger than the second, but like, even the second, when it gets kind of a little bit more messy and starts to like experiment with different things more, it's just, the whole time it just felt like totemic and like awe-inspiring to me that this movie worked at all. And like, the look and feel is just so varied throughout this movie. Like, sometimes it's like wide angle shots of like grand vistas or like beautiful interior light filled rooms, and it just feels like, wow, this is so grand and sweeping. Other times it's like a claustrophobic camera that's like following the character almost like Birdman, right? Like, it's like peering through like tight jazz bars and caves and things like that. And it is always doing different things, and that's why for 3.5 hours it feels like it's just like moving forward constantly, because there's just always something new to like experience and enjoy about it. And yeah, people are just fucking amazing. Felicity Jones too. Like, I've liked her in things before. I think at the time I liked Theory of Everything well enough when we reviewed it. And even On the Basis of Sex was like kind of like a Clafter movie, but still like it had its, its charms. She, I think, is just like fierce in this movie. Like, she taps into something that I've never seen her do before. Guy Pearce too. Like, he is someone that I don't typically think of as a very great actor. Like, he tends to be kind of clunky in movies more often than not, at least for me. And I think he's just like perfectly cast here as this kind of dim-witted multimillionaire tycoon who like wants to be seen as like culturally interesting, but he's actually just kind of like has nothing going on inside.
If I'm honest, I have to, both him and the guy who plays his son, they are doing performative performances. Mm-hmm. Their characters are very performative in just the way they talk, but their characters are, it's not just their choice to do the performance, it's the characters who are doing it. So it works for me, but it also is it's so silly. But I know that that's those people. Like, if I was transported to this time, there would be a guy who would be talking at me like that, and I'd be like, I get it, bro. Cool. But it's just, there was a little bit of weirdness for me where it was almost funny at times. But
yeah. What I find interesting about this movie is like, one of the reasons it seemed like it was going to be a rough sit is that it's called The Brutalist, and like Brutalist architecture, I'm not like an architecture buff, but like I know enough to know that is generally not regarded as like very pretty stuff. Like, that is usually like a time that people look back on and they're like, ugh, all these like raw cement, gray, blocky buildings, This movie manages to make that seem beautiful still in its own way. And it also like, I don't know, like the whole movie just, it makes you believe that what Laszlo is doing is like important and meaningful and beautiful, even though like aesthetically it isn't something I normally would be, but it's like the the movie, you could do so many metaphors easily for it, right? Like, the movie is a Brutalist building, right? It's like this big thing that is being completed and no one really knows why, and it seems like a major undertaking, but it just has to get done anyway, and now you're just staring at it like, holy shit. That is there. Whatever the fuck it is, it's there forever now, and yeah, I don't know. It's just very impressive.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. All right, moving on to, I would say, like, the polar opposite type of film is A Missing Part, which was directed by Guillaume Senez. And this is a very small, very, I would say, festival type movie, you know, the kind of thing we try to catch a few of whenever we go out to a film festival. It's a small film about a man who is a French guy who's living in Tokyo, driving cars for a living, who we learn as the story unfolds is trying to find his daughter, who he was separated from many, many years ago, so early ago that she doesn't really remember him anymore, or conceivably she wouldn't. This is a film about custody laws in Japan, which apparently make it very easy for one parent to take the child and then keep the other parent from ever seeing them or even knowing where they live. And it's just about father looking for his daughter. I believe the synopsis already spoils that he does find his daughter, right? Like, she exists, and this is about
he encounters his daughter.
He encounters her, and she doesn't yet know that he's her father, and it's about the kind of aching emotions and him trying to figure out what to do with that situation. I mean, this combines two of my favorite things, honestly: tearful stories about parents and kids, and Tokyo. So, like, I was in from the very beginning here. I thought this movie was just lovely, like, very, very small, you know, not too ambitious, not trying to change the world or be earth-shattering, but just as a quiet story of a man who has his own past that, again, it kind of trusts us to figure out over time. It doesn't spoon-feed us anything here. Who's trying to connect with his daughter, even though he's not perfect, and what decisions is he going to make? Will we agree with them or not? What is this going to drive him to do? How far can the audience sympathize with him? And all of that stuff I thought was just handled really beautifully. And yeah, this movie never made me cry. Like, this wasn't really shooting for the kind of big, weepy, emotional moments, but I felt the kind of, like, emotional tug or ache of this movie the whole way through. And it's the kind of thing, again, that I love going to festivals for. So I was pretty taken by this movie. It didn't feel like something that I'm going to be singing the praises of at the end of the year, but it's something that I'm really, really glad that I saw. How about you?
Yeah, I thought it was a beautiful little film. I mean, it's very, very simple. At the beginning, it might be too simple. Like, it's sort of just like a lot of meandering, and like you're kind of like waiting for things to kick off. But I think once you kind of understand what the main character is doing, and, you know, once you see him responding to the presence of his daughter without her knowing it's him, and kind of like how he takes that and what lengths he's going to kind of plan for what his future will be based on the context of not being able to get joint custody of his daughter. You know, it's just a beautiful kind of story. You know, it's very small and like narrowly focused, and it's part of a story that I didn't really know about. There's a lot of people in the crowd that seem to know about kind of what the experience of what it's like trying to, you know, be separated adults when there's a kid in the middle, right? Like in American films, there's lots of stories that involve that, but it's never about the legal side of it. Right. It's about the emotional side of it. And this film takes a deep look at, like, hey, yeah, if you separate, like, especially if you're a foreigner to Japan and you were married to, you know, somebody who was born there, you basically have zero rights.
Right.
Like, you can't do anything. And this is like just an interesting story to kind of couch it in that way and kind of look at the law from the standpoint of somebody who can't do anything about it. And I was definitely brought into the story and cared a lot for what was going on. And yeah, I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
All right. So the next film on the list is a little film called Babygirl. Babygirl is directed by Helena Rain, who you might know from directing a little film called Bodies, Bodies, Bodies. And it stars Nicole Kidman and Harris Dickinson. And it is basically a story of, you know, a high-powered CEO who, the way I wrote it down is finds an intern who finds an itch of hers that he can scratch.
Yep.
You know, like, didn't know what to expect going into this film. You know, I could assume based on the description of the film, kind of what I was going to expect. But what I got was a much weirder film than kind of what I was expecting. This is a loud film, and when I say loud, I mean it's in quotes, right? Not like a volume, but this is a very in your face film that's sort of about a woman's needs and this how she has those maybe potentially fulfilled by this one person who is specifically willing and able to help her with those needs. And this film, it presents these scenes as you're catching on to how this dynamic is going to play out. It brings you on in a way where it's kind of funny. It's when you, because this guy shows in just swinging his dick around,
right?
But like not really swinging his dick around. It's this other weird psychological thing that he's doing where like when he shows up, he just comes on strong as hell, and then you watch Nicole Kidman immediately clock it, like it, and then figure out whether or not she's willing to go through it. I still haven't figured out what this film is really trying to do. There's a space it is trying to play in, which is the loud portion of this film, but I don't know what it's saying about the power side of things. It's still something I'm chewing over, where the film ends at, where characters, once they realize where in the dynamic they fit, what characters say to each other. There's at least 3 characters who their dynamics of power within this corporation that they work in are all over the place. And I don't know what it actually wants to say about that premise. I just know what it wants to say about female sexuality and stuff like that. So, I mean, I know as much as I know about it, right? So this is a film that I'm still chewing over. I don't know what to do with it. But it definitely is a film that draws you in and keeps you in, and knows that it has you from the second it starts. So I appreciate it for that. But as I said, I'm still chewing over it. Steven, what do you make of this film?
I mean, honestly, my top line bullet point is the same as yours. I'm still figuring out what the fuck I think about Babygirl. Like, I have a lot of conflicting thoughts. Like the overriding, the loud thing it's doing, exploring women's desire and sensuality and kind of the way you might tap into taboos to get that is great. Like it accomplishes that for sure. It's pretty much impossible not to think about Eyes Wide Shut here because Nicole Kidman is here, and it's another New York movie about like the quote seedy underbelly behind romance and sexuality. It does it well. Like, it dances at the edge of some pretty disturbing fantasies like ravishment and submission, and I think it nails it. Like, I never found this like tasteless or tacky or something that was like misusing the subject matter in any way. If anything, I actually wish it had gone even harder. Like I think it could have I think it could have pushed more buttons and still kept me engaged, because it's just Nicole Kidman is great, and you definitely will follow her even as her character makes many decisions that I would not make, if I were in her situation. The thing that keeps me conflicted is I felt like whenever this movie was really like picking up steam and was getting ready to be like narratively about something, it would make a choice that made me be like, what do you think you're trying to say? Not that it had to be a message movie. It continually did these like little twists and turns where I would feel like it wanted to say something, but then what it said either didn't feel very strong or felt like it wasn't supported by the actual movie and the story that it was telling. And it's hard to explain, but it feels like this. The reason I think it could have gone harder is if this only wanted to be a kind of edgy, stylistic exploration of how it feels to want to break the rules and want to be desired and, be in a marriage that isn't fulfilling you, and then suddenly see this opportunity to get everything that you fantasized for. I think it could have just hit that really, really, really hard, and kind of rocked the audience. Or it could try to say something meaningful and tie it in a bow, but you have to really stick the landing to do that. And it feels like this was like a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B, and I can't tell if like I'm missing a bigger thing the movie is doing, or if, like how I felt about Bodies, Bodies, Bodies too, this is just like all style, but the substance isn't quite there. I think I like this movie a lot. Like I feel like people should definitely see it. I am very conflicted as to whether it is like an interesting experiment that didn't know how to finish the story, or if it is actually doing something really, really well and I'm just kind of missing the point.
Yeah, like I'm 100% willing to assume that I'm just missing the point. But what it feels like is I'm going to hand you a live grenade. Now you figure out what to do with it. Mm-hmm. It doesn't feel like it's explaining what explosives are and like what you should do if somebody hands you a live grenade. Right. It is specifically trying to throw questions and ideas and feelings out, all couched in this like stylistic sort of edgy sort of, who knows, maybe this is a real life office environment, but like it's trying to force you into these spaces and then ask you what you think about it. The film, to me, doesn't think about it. Mm-hmm. It just has the premise and throws you into the premise and lets you deal with it, which might be the intended goal. But for me, I wanted to feel, as you said, it doesn't have to be a message film, but I literally wrote down in quotes, what's the message?
Right. Because this is playing with power in more ways than just the sexual power dynamic, right? And it feels like it never really explores what some of that power means, other than throwing some mixed signals at you to like keep the audience kind of unsure of how they're meant to feel, which is like, again, I don't need to be told how to feel. It's just, this seemed like it wanted to say something and then it didn't say it, you know?
Yeah. And like, you know, this is a company whose CEO is a woman who has a, you know, protege or somebody coming up underneath her who has aspirations to be that too. And the way those dynamics play against each other, right at the end, then they introduce this other thing where there's another thing, which might be a company that owns the company.
Right.
And it implies a lot of stuff in this one interaction that makes you question. There's just a lot of stuff that it suddenly gets really, really messy in a film that's on purpose supposed to be messy. But then it's like, okay, I've made you buy into all this stuff. Now I'm just going to throw this wild card in and see what you think about that. And it's like, I don't know what you're trying to say, film.
Yep. All right. Speaking of messy films, let's talk about The End, directed by Joshua Oppenheimer. I basically insisted that we watch this movie because I love Joshua Oppenheimer's documentaries, right? I love The Act of Killing. I love The Look of Silence. I think he's just like a really bold, daring documentarian. And knowing he was making his first narrative feature just seemed very interesting to me. And then I learned it was a musical. Specifically...
About the apocalypse.
Yes. Specifically, this is a musical about a family who are living at basically the end of the world. You know, climate change has destroyed the earth and they're living in an underground bunker. And this is about what happens when a new person shows up all of a sudden. If I'm describing it in a way that sounds like a plot or narrative, I'm like misleading you, because this is not really a movie that wants to tell a story where a bunch of people change or go on a journey together. This is really a movie about self-delusion, right? About the thing people do, very much like Don't Look Up, when they're confronted with something that's really hard to deal with, and rather than actually talk about it, they just concoct this narrative that will make them feel better. That means the family, there's a son played by George McKay, who's basically doing like almost like Emma Stone in Poor Things. He's like the person who doesn't know the real world, so he has this kind of like childlike naivety, even though we see it in the body of this guy who's at least in his late 20s. I don't actually know. George McKay, he is being very goofy, but his character believes himself to be very sincere. And piling that on with a golden era sounding musical, on paper, I think this is a brilliant idea for a story. Like, what better way to show how people lie to each other and paint see the world in rose-colored glasses, even when it is literally burning, than using musicals, right? Where people are smiling and singing about lightness and life and how happy and wonderful everything is. Like I think it is a really good idea, and I can see why this movie was made, you know?
Yeah.
Like, the elevator pitch makes sense to me. And people sell it. Like, Tilda Swinton and Michael Shannon, too, are, like, totally committed to being these weird, fragile people who think highly of themselves, but you could tell, like, one word could make them crack. But actually experiencing the movie, as opposed to just thinking about it or talking about it, man, it is not an easy sit. This thing is, like, 2.5 hours long. We saw it fairly late at night after a full day of screenings. And like, I don't want to be the runtime police. You know, like I've had like 7-hour movies that I loved, but I'm just not convinced that this premise should have been more than 90 minutes, right? Like this is an idea that is meant to provoke the audience of what are the ways that all of us are lying to ourselves right now too. What are the stories we tell ourselves to make it be okay that we didn't do more to save the world? You know, that's fine. I'm interested in it. But beating us over the head with it for 2.5 hours when not a lot really changes, you know, the songs kind of bleed together, characters kind of come on the cusp of changing and then change back and then change again and change back and change back. And there's just a lot of kind of redundancy that keeps it feeling like nothing is happening and makes it very hard to actually stay on board. And then I also feel like occasionally it underlines the message way too much. Like, when characters, especially the outsider who comes in, who's played by, I believe, Moses Ingram, she starts to question their fake narrative, you know, and talk about history and the real things that happened. And I get it. Again, on paper, I like the idea of a character doing that, but it makes it feel like the movie is preaching to me all of a sudden rather than actually making me think, you know, and there's just... Add to that it just like isn't visually very interesting. It's very flat, you know, it's just kind of like people in this little bunker all the time. And yeah, I don't know. I thought this was a rough sit. I think this really wants to be a stage play that's like half as long as it is. I think it could be a really interesting, like experimental work, but as a movie, I kind of think it falls apart. How about you?
Yeah, so it's interesting. One of your complaints is actually a strength for me. But I will say that, like, as you said, yes, on paper, great premise. I even like the idea of, you know, this family, they live in a literal echo chamber where they are just like, they've built their own narrative about what happened at the end of the world. And, you know, they live in the bunker. They earned that bunker. It's basically, what if the Guy Pearce character from The Brutalist at the end of that film built a bunker, right, went into it, and then stayed there until the world got destroyed, and then just him and his people were inside that bunker, and then suddenly somebody showed up and started to call into question their personal narratives that they've been writing because they have nothing else to do in the bunker but write the entire history of their lives.
Yeah.
So like I am down for that premise. Before the film, you and I were out at dinner. We were like, you know, trying to blow through dinner real quickly before we could run over to the theater and watch it. And I jokingly said that, like, you know, I'll be able to survive whatever this film is going to be so long as, like, the music is good. Because, like, you know, that can propel me along. I like the musical arrangements.
Yeah.
The arrangements themselves, like if I remove the lyrics and I'm just listening to the melody people are singing, my favorite thing in musical is when two different people are singing two different things at the same time. This film, every song has that.
It's great.
And it's beautiful. I love it. I genuinely like the musical arrangements in this film. The lyrics are often nonsense. The story is often nonsense. It was very, very, like, I was just, every time somebody was not singing, I was like, please, somebody start singing. Every once in a while, like, there'd be like a musical, like, bling, like somebody, like a little flutter of music as though a song were going to start, and then a song wouldn't start. And I was like, oh my God, I'm not going to survive this. And it kept making me rough. To the thing of, it feels like they're just in this little bunker and it feels like it wants to be a stage play. That was my favorite part about this movie. It feels like they literally built the entire bunker, and then there's just some, you know, set extensions off in the distance to make it look like this carved out cave.
Right.
But what I love the blocking of this film, like just the fact that it always feels like this isn't magical choreography that people are doing. It's a lot of just like taking 4 steps and stopping,
right,
but it's a lot of long takes with a camera physically moving through a space, and it feels like this is a real bunker that they have built to look like a real house that's not in a bunker. And I love the story that tells, right? Like just watching these people exist in this space was interesting to me. Whenever we were locked off in one space and just dialogue was happening, didn't care for it. If people were singing or a camera was moving through the space in a long take, I was suddenly perked up and interested. And I like so many of the ideas this film is playing with. It just, to me, the overall execution was not great.
Yeah, I don't disagree with the things that you were saying either. Like, even though the songs bleed together musically, I think they're beautiful. I think they're lovely, and I was happy when they sang. You know, our audience, there was a moment in the movie where it seemed like they turned into laughing in a kind of like mean way, like laughing at the movie rather than laughing with the movie, which I kind of feel like is missing the point. Like there's a scene that I actually really liked. Like, it's one of my favorite moments in the movie where it does something that actually Fleischman and Trouble also did, which is not a new show or book, but I happened to catch up with it a week ago, so it's on my mind. They talk about the idea of whether is all of marriage just like looking back at that moment when you really wanted one another and just trying to remember, right? Trying to remember for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
And this movie takes that in a very literal way, where Michael Shannon's character is writing his memoir, and in the process to like juice the story, he tries to, quote, remember or invent what it is that made him fall in love with his wife. And that bursts into the same kind of music that you would see in a musical of how much he loved her, how he met her. He's like smiling and dancing and singing, and the audience was laughing in a way that is like, isn't this so stupid? Oh my God, this movie, I can't believe it. And to me, like, that is the whole fucking point, is like the delusion that he can slip into, and like making you wonder, is it good that they're keeping themselves happy and delusional? Because what, are they going to just be sad until they die? Like, is that going to be any better?
Yeah.
When it's working, I think this movie is really, really interesting and pulls that off.
Yeah.
And like the music is moving to me in that moment, even though I know that it's like total bullshit. And I think that's like the point, and I think it pulls it off well.
Yeah.
I also do think like the blocking is interesting, and as a play, I think it would be a potentially good play. There is something about the stilted line delivery that, like, most of the time, there's a built-in reason for why it exists, right? Characters are speaking in a very performative way, like you said of the characters in The Brutalist, too, you know, where, like, they are literally performing to themselves and to each other.
Yeah.
But there are some other times when people are breaking and they're having an argument, or they're upset, or something else comes out, and they're still stilted in the way that they're talking. And in those moments, I was like, fuck. This isn't only a choice. This is also just like not being executed that well.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. Like I think it's a really interesting idea, and I just can't, in good faith, actually recommend people sit down and watch it.
Yep. And yeah, with the end, that is the end of this episode of the Spoiler Warning podcast. Stephen Miller, if people want to find you this week, where can they do that?
People can find me at Blue Sky or Threads at sdavidmiller or sdavidmiller.com.
People can find me at ChristopherInRealLife.com or Christopher IRL on a number of social platforms. You can find the podcast over at thespoilerwarning.com, where you can get a bunch of the back episodes of the show. If you want to subscribe to the show, you can do so on Overcast, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or wherever podcasts are found. If you want to know when the episodes go live, you can follow us at twitter.com/spoilerwarning, facebook.com/thespoilerwarning, or instagram.com/thespoilerwarning. If you want to get a hold of us directly, you can send an email to fans@thespoilerwarning.com, or you can use the contact form on our site. Music for this episode will come from a track selected from artlist.io, so hopefully you are enjoying that. And yep, we got another 2 films tonight. So we are going to go get ready to go see those.
Powder our noses.
Yeah. And then tomorrow we're going to be flying home, and then we'll figure out later in the week to record part 3. So get ready for that to come then. Whew. All right. Let's get out of here, Steven.
Bye.
Bye.